All right, welcome everyone to today's SaaS conversation on global expansion and operational issues. I'm Lauren Kelley, and I will be the moderator, as I am for these programs that we carry out once a month at OPEXEngine on operational and performance issues for SaaS companies. So just taking a couple of minutes to go through the housekeeping. We like these discussions to be very open discussions. So please ask questions. You can put them in chat. You can put them in the Q&A, although the chat's probably easiest. And we'll try and answer them either during the conversation or we have some time reserved at the end. And if you would like a copy of the webinar, you will be sent a copy of the slides as well as the recording after the webinar. But please keep the conversation going and feel free to reach out and ask any questions at any time as we go through. So with that, let me fully introduce myself. I see a lot of names of people that I know and customers and folks in the industry on the participant list, but I see a lot of new names. I'm Lauren Kelley. I'm the CEO and founder of OPEXEngine. OPEXEngine is a SaaS benchmarking platform for SaaS companies to benchmark themselves against peers and competitors. We work with hundreds and hundreds of companies. We've been doing this for about 15 years, and we were recently acquired as a separate company. We're still an independent company, but we're wholly owned by Bain & Company, one of the largest global consultancies, strategic consultancies in the world. And Bain is also a major consultancy to private equity, which has become quite a strong player in the technology space. So one of the questions is, you know, besides the fact that international is very much in the news these days, why are we doing this? Why are we focusing on international operations? You know, SaaS companies originally, when we started OPEXEngine, were not that particular. We're primarily focused on the US market. It was the biggest market. It was the quickest to adopt SaaS products. And even companies like European companies like Zendesk that got started in Denmark, but then moved to the US pretty early and became, in order to become a global leader, became an American company. But things have changed, and we see companies at, you know, certainly at 100 million, and certainly companies that go public with strong growth rates, doing a significant portion of their business internationally. And the market has evolved. It's complicated, but there are platforms and best practices for being successful and moving more quickly. And so that's why we're looking at this. So Gartner forecasts that the global spending on cloud services is easily going to exceed $1 trillion by the end of the decade, and probably several years earlier than that. So in the OPEXEngine benchmarking, we ask companies and we have them segment out the percentage of their revenue from customers outside the US. And I think it's interesting to look at the difference between fast growth companies and slow growth companies, especially when they reach maturity, because at that point you can also see pretty clear signals that slower growth companies are doing less business overseas and faster growth companies are doing more business overseas. You know, 31%, they're almost 32% in some of the cases that we see. And if you're talking about a, say, $200 million company, 250 million, we're talking about 80 million to 100 million for a number of companies in revenue. So that's pretty important, and it's important to make sure that you're doing it right. And as I have pointed out here at the bottom, this is based on 2020 data. We are currently at OPEXEngine working very hard on the current 2022 benchmarking based on the most recent data. And I would love to look at this slide when we have that completed, because I believe these numbers will be that much stronger and also bigger at earlier stages. And that's part of why we have Daniëlle Keeven here today, because Daniëlle is just so impressive in terms of her background and what she's done internationally, working with a whole variety of companies. But her experience in finance and operations internationally is terrific. So welcome, Daniëlle. I'd love to understand a little bit about how you ended up at Paddle. What made you come to Paddle, and based on your past experience?
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. As pointed out as well, I have an extensive background overseas. I think I originally started in the Caribbean and the Americas in a totally different type of industry. And I was sold on a myth that in Europe, people work 8-hour days. It's not true. To buy it. It's still worth the trip and it's still worth the switch, but it's not actually how it works in the tech space. So when I moved to Amsterdam a couple of years ago, I joined Booking.com, which was quite big. When we wanted to change some things, I found them to be quite challenging as well. But working at Booking was fascinating to also be exposed to the global issues of how does accountability in work and legislation, what are the tax things to consider and how to grow your business, and especially Booking already being global. So looking at how to fix some of these things or address them retroactively as they happen was exciting. From there, I stepped over to MessageBird.com, which had already also a global presence, but was very much in the scaling phase of opening different entities globally and all of the fun stuff that entails. And then I was approached by Paddle, and honestly, Paddle just blew my mind. I think for me, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to do a marketing thing here, but Paddle just solves so many of the finance challenges that I've seen that we encounter on a global platform that we play with, that we face, and also in a big extent, I think what we as finance leaders fear the most, Paddle takes head on. And so I think for me, that was super attractive. And that's kind of why I joined the company.
That's fabulous. And I should mention, this is also a subject that's near and dear to my heart, because I've worked and lived in Germany in a couple of different jobs. I've worked and lived in Paris. I was general manager for about 22 countries for an American software company. And I've lived and worked in the UK, and then I've set up operations for a variety of software companies in Europe. And it's great to have somebody who has some experience talking about this. But maybe just super quickly, let's just explain what Paddle does, because I'm not sure it's as well known among a lot of our audiences as it just blows me away as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Paddle is an end-to-end platform for everything that you need as a SaaS business to do business anywhere in the world. So basically, currently, if you look out there for solutions, and I'm sure that many of you have, like, how am I going to set up business, whether it be local in the US or globally? You need to investigate how you're going to set up your payment methods. I think that's one of the big ones, because you want your money, of course. You want to set up how am I going to do my invoicing. You want to take a look at what are the tax legislation items that I need to look at. Where do I need to register? When do I need to register? And I think especially because software is relatively new to legislation and tax compliance, there's so many different elements that need to be tracked. And actually, that's what Paddle does. It does all of that. It's the one-stop shop for everything. So basically, Paddle takes care of your invoicing. It invoices your customers. We make sure that we have a payment provider that is fitted to the market and the currencies that you want. In addition to that, we also manage any chargebacks that are coming in and any kind of nuisance that may pop up from that. So we're, in essence, a merchant of record for software companies.
Cool. Well, this is not a webinar about Paddle, but it definitely establishes sort of your understanding of the space. So let's talk about timing and just deciding to move internationally. I mean, it's not, the US market is still the biggest market. There are lots of complexities moving internationally. And what do you think are the key sort of factors in determining that you need to go local for a SaaS company specifically?
Yeah, I think we started off with this, and it's a little bit idealistic, but I think mostly the intrinsic motivation of why you are in the software business. Most software was obviously designed out of a desire to either solve a problem or seize an opportunity to optimize life, a process, or a customer journey, and so on. And so my first thing would be, why not make this available to the world? I think that's the biggest motivation that I can think of, like, hey, we created a software, like share it with everyone. I think to your point, the US market is definitely the largest, which is also why I think most international markets seek to penetrate the US market initially and potentially a bit more aggressively, just because of, again, the market that we acquire through going through that process. However, I think for the US as well, it can be super attractive to go overseas besides your intrinsic motivations, because you're also kind of insulating yourself against potential local fluctuations. So your dependency on your local market is not going to be as high if you spread out through globally. And I think also one thing to consider is, what is your demand out there? I think in terms of timing, at some point, like I know a few software companies based in the US that I love working with through our US entity. And I'm like, why is this not available in Europe? And so I think when you start hearing those kind of questions as well come up from your customers, it's a good moment to start considering to expand globally.
So it's definitely, do the research, figure out the market. There's a lot of resources out there to help you figure it out. But the bottom line is that European and Asian and Latin American markets are catching up to the US in terms of maturity of acquiring, and purchasing SaaS products. There's you mentioned leadership issue in terms of what your position in the market is. Do you need to go overseas in order to make sure that you maintain your competitiveness? I think from my experience, the other thing that's super important is, one of the things for American companies particularly is they tend to wait until they're really mature to go internationally. And you saw from the chart I showed before.
Yeah.
Except for that, and it didn't used to be this way in the PC software world or the network, software world, but in the SaaS world, it's been that way. And the problem is, once your company is really mature, you have sort of an established process of going into a new, territory product, launching new products. And going international is not, I think, and I think the research bears it out, it is not like hiring, let me just hire an international sales guy and, they're going to take care of it. Or I was talking to someone recently and gave the example of, one of the founders of the company who now doesn't have as much to do. And so you say, go take France, because France is such a fun country to, build a business in. And they don't know doing business in France, and France may not actually be the right place to get started. So I think it's critical that you have executive bandwidth to really focus on this, as this is a whole new, you really need to go back to your origins when you were really starting out, listening to customers and evolving quickly, and everybody in the company was focused on this. It is not just a sales and maybe, one person in finance who's sort of tasked with handling the international expansion. Do you have examples among your customers of, where you think they've really done it right in terms of determining, one key market to focus on and having the right support on the company side?
I think so to be fair, when we onboard a customer, they immediately have access to the full global market. So maybe that's not a fair comparison to give right now. But I think if you're going to do it on your own, I think definitely it is important for you to select one market first, or two markets, and not even two. I wouldn't even do them simultaneously, because there's a massive task involved. And I think you mentioned finance, you mentioned sales. I would also think that legal is a big player in this, because as soon as you decide if you're going to go out on your own and establish an entity overseas, you will have to do with local compliance regulations as well as your tax filings and so on. So I do think that looking at your software product that you offer, I would say, again, to your point, listen to your customers. Where are they outside of the US? Where could your software, for example, be a good fit for the market to start off investigating, opening that door first? So there's a lot of hooks and needles around having to go out on your own to do it. So definitely then I would select one market first and then tackle them as they come based on the demands. I do think you pointed out as well a very important point, that make sure you're looking at this and make sure you're thinking it, because you could be missing out on revenue. It's all latent revenue unless you go out and get that, and make sure you're expanding at the right moment as well. Having the right team around you to do that is critical if you are going to do it on your own. One person cannot do it all. That's not possible. So you do have to consider what it is that you need to do so. So
let's talk about one issue certainly for American companies. What about Brexit? It used to be that US companies oftentimes would set up their European headquarters in the UK. A lot of companies have chosen, or for a variety of reasons, had already set up in Ireland instead of in the UK. But if you could give us some sort of current information, I mean, what's it like? Do you think that UK is still a beachhead for Europe, or is it more complex now?
I think, I do think there was an immediate reaction to the situation. And I think as businesses usually see something occur and there's an immediate reaction that may or may not be based on facts. So often it's a fear reaction, like, let me move out because I don't know what this means. Now that things have settled, I do see also companies moving to the UK. So I don't think necessarily it changes the dynamics. I just think it was a period of insecurity where nobody knew what legislation was going to look like, what are the relationships going to be, everything had to be renegotiated. So I do think now that it's a bit more established, it's a bit calmer. I think we saw a little bit of the tailwind coming in with Visa and MasterCard applying interchange fees. And seeing how that impacted that as well. So those have all been interesting developments for sure.
Okay. So it's settled down a little bit, but there's still some nuances to it.
Yes, definitely. And I think, again, it depends on where you want to, where is your market? Where is your customer? If they're in the UK, then establish yourself in the UK. If they're in Europe, then I would encourage a European hub, right? So I think it depends where you want to move to, as in your business, to open up and go to those specific locations.
No, that makes sense. And then COVID kind of changed everything because everybody's remote or more disparate. So
yeah, and I actually think, to the COVID point, that why go global? I think the US software companies have been super centered in the US, and more you're seeing the decentralization of people moving overseas as well. So I think this is a great opportunity to evaluate what this can do for your company as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So let's talk about some of those regulations, and we'll talk about tax in a few minutes, but could you talk a little bit specifically about how do you know what the local requirements are for company registration, and how they differ between countries, and how onerous are they?
Yes, so I am going to randomly take Mexico. I don't know if there's another country that maybe we want to think about. But for example, let's say you do want to expand to Mexico. I think the first thing to do is to make sure that you have a business case for yourself, that there is an ROI for that market. The second thing is definitely seek out a local partner. For example, if we look at Mexican legislation, it's very challenging to open a bank account. It is challenging to register your company. So I think even registering your company takes at least 5 to 6 months for different reasons. I think if you Google it, it will probably give you a shorter time. I can assure you, when you turn in your paperwork, it will take longer. The same thing goes for opening a bank account. And there are some, for example, local legislations that will require you to have a local representation in the country. which sometimes is more challenging than other times to do if you do not have a local presence or a person already on the ground. So there are different challenges that come with different locations. There are some countries that do not require local representation, that you can just set up an entity and then you look into what are the compliance issues that I need to make sure are in place, what are the corporate filings that I need to make sure are submitted, and what are the tax regulations around that. And I think also one of the key things, like you're highlighting here as well, is local hiring and employee regulations. So that's like a whole other box to unpack just by itself. One of the things that I think is critical is to look at the countries where you're hiring. And I think especially in the software space, there's such opportunity right now because more and more people are hiring globally, which you can do through two ways. Either you set up a hub where you have X amount of employees and you indeed decide to set up an entity. When you set up an entity, you can set it up just to be a hiring entity or a business operational entity. So there is a difference between the two. So you can either do that, or you can use one of the employers of records, right? So there's a couple of them out there, especially in the US as well. I know there's a couple of very famous ones, but definitely it is critical to make sure that you are compliant, because if you're not compliant and you're hiring internationally, you might be subject to local tax in a country where you're not registered if you are not going about your hiring correctly.
So just going back to the company registration, do you know offhand which countries don't require a company registration?
I don't know offhand. No, there's a list of them.
Okay. Because the other thing, it's interesting you mentioned Mexico, because especially just recently in the last couple of weeks, I think particularly in light of the fact that a lot of at least local companies here had development teams in the Ukraine and sometimes in Russia as well. And there's a, current situation where people are shifting and looking for talent in Latin America, Mexico, through actually all the way through to Argentina, because there's a lot of good.
Argentina, yeah, very, very high on the tech radar right now. Correct.
Yeah, good people, same time zone, not quite as complicated as dealing with, 6 or 12 hours differences, depending on where you're going.
Yes.
So in terms of local hiring and employee regulations, I mean, that's another thing that's actually a lot easier today, because you have these PPOs or whatever they're called, payroll processing companies that will take care of everything for you. What about, currency management and payment providers?
Yeah, I think that's interesting for me. Okay, I'm gonna geek out a little bit because I think to me it's interesting anyway. So especially in terms of payments, right? I think this is so critical to any of our businesses to make sure that we have the currencies that we want, to make sure that we have the type of payments that that are local to the countries where we want to do business. And I think that being said, actually having a high acceptance rate on your payments can also make you consider setting up an international entity. What I mean with that is, for example, you can have a contract with a local payment provider that is global. However, because you're contracted with them in the US, the routing of their payments in other locations, their acceptance rate is going to be lower than what it is in the US. And the reason why is that you might have to have a local entity in a different country to register with the same payment provider to have a better routing in place. So I think that's one element as well of going global and considering setting up a global entity. And in terms of currency management, I think this is a definite hot topic. I think to your point, you just mentioned like Argentina. Argentina is a fascinating country, and I hope I get to go there someday. I haven't been yet, it's on my list. But besides that, I think there's just so much complexity around the currency. While setting up a bank account there is actually super easy once you're registered, and the timelines are shorter, the currency fluctuates tremendously. Like there's almost a day or a week inflation rate that our employees are confronted with as well. So I think those are some of the nuisances as well of going international. I don't mean to do this intentionally, but I think for me, if I had to expand and if I could use paddle, this is one of those things that would also be mitigated because you choose the currency you're paid out in. Not saying you have to use this, because obviously this is not a marketing thing, but I think definitely if you're considering who you're going to partner with, that is one of the things that will mitigate some of these exposures that you have internationally by setting up a local bank account.
Wow. Yeah, it is complicated, and it's definitely, it's so in the news right now because I think we all thought, the dollar is very stable and is sort of a, is the worldwide currency, but now you have the so much going on that's roiling the currency markets. Not that the US dollar isn't still stable, but there's a lot of changes going on. And with cyber currency sort of growing, that just makes it a lot more complicated. There was Tom Tungus had a great blog, I think about a month ago. It was just sort of shocking to think that a lot of SaaS companies, either currently or in the future, may be paid in cyber currencies in some areas. And, when you think about currency management, it's hard enough to think about the euro, the dollar. And then if you expand to Latin America, it gets a little more complex. And if you're in Asia, even more complex. But cyber, where the value can.
Yes, absolutely. I actually have a 15-year-old son who's like really into NFTs and non-fungible tokens, for those who haven't taken a look at that yet. And we are very much monitoring how cryptocurrency is behaving, and the fluctuations are immense. I do think it would be naive for us not to think that at some point this is going to stabilize. I don't know which coin or anything like that, but the technology itself makes sense. And especially looking at the NFT movement. I didn't want to mention it here, but I think that's also another reason to look at global expansion for your business, because there is a lot more financial means being moved to different parts of the world than before. And I think this is a wave that will continue, because it really is enabling a lot of artists to share their work. And especially in rural areas where usually you wouldn't think there's a market or a business opportunity, these are coming up at a rapid speed.
Yeah, well, and that's the whole point of SaaS, is that it changed things in the United States. You see SaaS companies all over the United States in places where there didn't used to be anything, because you didn't have the employees, you didn't have the funding, you didn't have the infrastructure. And now that's the same thing throughout the world. It's pretty impressive. So let's talk a little bit about global payroll and managing that from a finance perspective, because that's also pretty complicated. If you were to do that, obviously a PPO or something like that helps. There's pros and cons between using one that has the international capability and versus using several different ones that have expertise in different markets. Do you have any experience with that?
Yes. So I'm thankful to have quite some experience with payroll in general, both just determining how to set it up as well as the liability it entails. I think if you're not going to use an employer of records, and I think what's interesting is even an employer of record, the legal safety net, I would say, does have its limits. So I would encourage to make sure that your legal team is taking a look at how the setup works. Most employers of records that you would use can either do employee style, so that they're hiring the person as an employee, or they can hire them as a contractor. And there's a different legislative approach to that. So just make sure your legal team is involved in making sure that that is correct to your risk appetite as a company. If you are looking to do it yourself and expand globally and hire in different countries, and say, for example, I'm going to go back to Argentina because you brought it up, but Argentina has a lot of
go there too.
Yeah, Argentina has a lot of tech talent, right? And it's definitely an up and coming market. To hire there is a limit. There are a limited amount of employer of records that you can use. Next to that as well, there are more benefits to hiring locally in Argentina, which means that you'll have to set up an entity to employ people directly. The reason why is because if you're paying through an invoice, you're going to get almost half the value of your money's worth. So you'll be paying double of what you would be paying if you're paying payroll locally. So those are some of the benefits that are interesting to know. And these things are going to vary country by country, right? So I think that the global marketplace has a lot of different angles to play at. My personal recommendation would be, if you are starting to set up different hubs, like different places globally for payroll, I would recommend to try to find a global provider for payroll that can support you. What that means is that they will have a counterpart like in Europe, in the UK, in Ireland, or that'd be like, hey, we can run your payroll for you. This is a dashboard, you can run it through here. And then for you, as a finance person, but also your people team and your human resource department will thank you for it, because you won't be dealing with like 10 different payroll providers versus having it all centralized, and you'll have a good overview. And the other thing I think that isn't spoken about a lot is really consider what it means to employ globally, because the benefits are so different. I mean, like if we look at the US, the vacation is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, more or less?
Mostly 3 weeks.
Yeah. And like, if you look at Europe, mostly it's 25 days. And so like, it's like, how do you reconcile the benefits for your employees? So I think this is all a lot of, to me, fun stuff to figure out together with the people team as well, to determine what are best practices locally and how do we impact the local market. And I think the other thing to consider in hiring globally also is, how are you going to benchmark your salary? Like, and I'm in favor of hiring internationally, definitely leverage the local value as well, to reward them to what is normal, but sometimes that market discrepancy is huge. And so then you as a company also have that question, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to say, okay, this is what is, the adjusted cost of living as well is significantly lower, so it makes sense? Or to say, hey, I'm going to pay everybody a flat rate, which might not be as beneficial financially for your company. But I think these are conversations that you will encounter when you start hiring globally and setting up.
That's such a great point, because that, really came up in COVID, where for US companies, because once their employee base is sort of disseminated outside of Silicon Valley and the Boston area, which tend to be quite high areas with, easily a 40 or 50%, wage uplift just for employees in those areas. What do you do in the US? What do you do when somebody's living, they're the VP of sales, but they live in, a low cost area? Should they be paid the highest rate in the US for a VP of sales, or should they be paid something that's, comparable? Or what about someone who was hired in Silicon Valley, but then now is living 100% in, Oklahoma? And then you expand on that internationally, and it does make it complicated when you have people who are earning so much less or so much more just because of the place that they live in. And I think it's both a financial, but it's also a cultural and company principle decision.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those are fun things to think through, because there's no black and white answer to them. So you need to identify for yourself, where do I stand? What do I want to do with this? And how am I going to approach it? So yeah.
So there's a question here in the chat. It says some companies have local entities, local general manager or heads of sales, but the contracts are signed with the US entity. What do you think about that arrangement? So does that affect the, the requirements if it's a US contract?
So if they are signed with your US entity, then their contract is with the US entity, if that makes sense. So I think it depends on how your business is set up, but that does not mean for example, let's say you hired someone in Canada, but if their contract is with the US, then they're not local by entity, right?
So you're saying that they're not governed by Canadian employment practices, they're governed by the location of the legal contract. Yes. Which would be with the US entity.
And I'm not a lawyer by any means, but I think that's something definitely to look at. I think when it comes to, for example, contractors, then it makes sense to hire them with your main legal entity. So then it doesn't necessarily, it's not determined where they are located, because you could have international people as well working as contractors. But I think employees is definitely, that's a different angle to go for.
Okay. And I think I do seem to remember there are variations on that, because some countries, even if the contract's with the US headquarters, they still have some requirements for employment that would require it to then be governed by local regulations. Yep. So you'd have to get advice on that. But there's a clarification. My question was more for customer or sales contracts, where presumably it sounds like, is there a problem for a local, if I can interpret this, and Doug, maybe I'll have you speak, but if I'm saying this correctly, if you have a local salesperson, but they're having customers sign a US contract, so the contract is with the US, because when you think about it, SaaS companies, part of the reason they didn't go internationally was that because they didn't have to, physically deliver product locally, and tends to be less localization today. A lot of companies were just serving the world market from their US headquarters.
Yes.
And so now you have feet on the ground, but they're still using the same contract. So are there any problems with that you've seen?
So if you're US based, your salesperson is US based and your customer is international based.
The salesperson is internationally based, let's say.
If the salesperson is internationally based, it depends upon the country. However, I can share with you that I've been at a company, which shall not be named, that, for example, was exposed to potential local tax claims because the authority was of the opinion that the salesperson in their country was signing contracts locally in their country, and therefore they were entitled to taxes over their revenues. So I would definitely take a double look at it from a legislative point of view, and it does depend what local means, as in like which country, because the legislation may differ. But especially in execution of contracts, location does matter. And it could expose you to taxes on the revenue generated from that contract or on that location.
Okay, and that's a great segue to our next point, talking more specifically about taxes. And I think most American companies are starting to get used to the fact that in the US, it's an evolving regulatory framework between each state in terms of sales tax within a particular tax, and between a particular state, and what the definition of nexus is, meaning, that you are an entity that should be taxed, and then multiply that by country. Do you want to speak about that? And then I have a specific question about India, but let's talk about it in general first.
I think the US landscape period is challenging because if you're playing in all 50 states, you will know in some states software is subject to tax, in others it is not. Then it's also interesting because some of the legislation treats software-based apps tools differently. A good example would be like, for example, a Zoom that we're using right now. Is that software or is it telecommunications? And that also opens the door to two different types of tax. However, for example, just in the US alone, there's no straightforward answer. Every single state manages that differently. In some states, it's considered software, and in others, it's considered telecommunications. In other states, it's not taxed at all. So I think just looking at the complexities in the US alone for tax landscape, it's quite challenging. And if we expand that globally, it gets a lot more fun, I would say. I think there's a lot more different tiers of tax and different definitions of software tax, which really have to be mastered. Like in some instances, the software that you are selling internationally into a local market is not subject to tax unless you're selling it as a local to your local markets instead of to an international market. So I think there's a lot of complexities around that as well.
So we have a specific question. How does a software company handle withholding taxes in places such as India?
It depends on their tax requirements. And I think that's where our tax tooling comes in as well, just to kind of look at what the requirements are there. In principle, you know, if you're going to set up an entity, you're going to have to run it as if you're locally based there, and you'll have to comply with withholding tax. And some of it may be challenging. I think one of the other elements that makes it challenging is your invoice tooling. Are you using an in-house invoice tooling, or are you using an external invoice tooling, which should also cover some of your tax needs? But I think even if you consider withholding tax and just the taxes due and how those complexities work, they're different in every single country. In India specifically, I don't know all of India's insides and outs. I usually just like get involved in the high level pain points if needed, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a complicated environment. We haven't really talked that much about Asia Pac. I mean, obviously China is a big market. And, you know, we don't know how that's going to change, but do you know much about how you know, what's required in terms of doing business in China, in terms of having to register your company, in terms of paying taxes and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think China is an interesting one as well. If you are a local seller based in China and you have your software that you want to sell, if you sell it internationally, it's not subject to tax. If you sell it locally, it is. And also as a software company, if you're international, there may be instances where you're not required to locally register because you're not based in China. So the business situations may differ as well from what it is that you're selling into the country. But definitely, I think that's also a very good example of a very challenging country to operate in as well, but definitely huge market potential. And having a presence there, I think is super important to expand your software business as well and growth.
Yeah. So speaking of that, or maybe even speaking about India, for example, a lot of companies have remote employees in India. Do you know if that is one of the things that we're seeing in the US is questions about some states tax nexus is, you know, being sort of having a definite office in a state. Sometimes it's just the amount that you're selling in a particular state. You know, there's a sort of trigger when you get to that level, then you have to start collecting sales tax. But there is some conversation about, you know, just having remote employees, like 1 or 2 employees, not a real office or not a real sales organization. What is that like in Europe or also in India? Do you know if that establishes nexus?
It depends on how you set up the contracts. So if they are set up as contractors, it's a different relationship than if they are set up as employees. And I think I'm going to add an extra cautionary here as well, because just because your contract says they are contractors, if the relationship mimics that of an employment relationship, that actually exposes you to having them legislatively being considered as employees. So you would still be liable. I'm not an employment expert. This is just like issues that I've dealt with in global expansion. But definitely I would take a look at the local legislation dictates this. You can have a contractor that works for you for an X period of time. And depending on the local country, if the time is exceeded, they are considered your permanent employees. And that then establishes the tax nexus. Okay.
Interesting. And I expect it'll get more and more complicated before it gets easier.
Yes, definitely. And it's different, right? Because I mean, if you're thinking in terms of outsourcing, that's a whole different relationship. That's a very clear, different type of relationship of having people working in a different country. But I think when you're dealing with, especially with contractors, depending on which country they're operating in, make sure that your people team is well versed in a relationship that they have.
Yeah, and we have clear rules here in the US, and although they do differ by state, here in Massachusetts, they're very sort of strong laws about contractors, and you know, you can pay people as a contractor, but if they meet the criteria for an employee, then they need to have benefits and have certain requirements met, even if you want them to be a contractor.
Yeah,
I think, you know, Microsoft helped the rest of us improve our policies around that.
Yeah.
So some of the questions now that we're getting are on, it is really complicated in SaaS where companies, because it's in the cloud, and whether the revenue is being, coming from an international location, and then the seller is based in the US, or at some point the seller is determined to be based in some other country.
Yeah.
Do you have, any thoughts about that? One of the questions, I'll just read it, but I think what they're talking about is whether there's a retroactive way that a European, and this is specifically saying the EU. So if a US entity had sales in the EU, so without any entity in the EU, and then established an EU entity, can they be taxed on those previous sales, or is it just from the time that there's an entity established? And then, it also gets into company organization, like, we don't even want to go into the sales discussion about, who in the company sort of gets credit for the sales, but we're just talking about the tax.
Yeah,
ownership.
So in terms of tax registration, it's interesting because that also differs by country. There are countries, because the EU is everybody, but the EU is comprised of different countries, so the regulations do differ. There are countries where you are only considered that you have to pay tax once you are registered. And then they will not look back and say you owe us this amount of money. They'll only look from the moment you registered, how much revenue has come through.
Going forward.
Yes, majority of the countries do have a threshold, which is, for example, as well, like early on, we said, hey, we operate in 320 different countries as a company for us as well. We do monitor the entire landscape just to make sure that our revenue thresholds are either maintained below or are met, and at what point is a tipping point to register locally. So every single country where you do business in does have different thresholds. Some of them don't have a threshold at all. So you have to register as soon as you're doing business in those countries. So again, it differs. It's not a blanket answer. So it depends on which country it is.
Okay. And then there's a question, would love to know what tools others are using to manage business registration and tax compliance for US and abroad. Obviously, there's one platform, but there's several.
They're all using Paddle, just kidding. No, I think for the US, a famous one is Avalara. And I think even if you Google, hey, tax solutions for the US, you'll get like a list of them. In order of preference as well, to help scale the challenges. I do know that some of them are more expensive than others. So I would, again, you look them up, look at what's the best fit for your business, what is the volume that is coming through, and what makes the best sense at that moment.
Okay, great. And then if you were going to pick, this is a great question. If you were going to pick 2 to 3 countries to set up subsidiaries in, if you were a, SaaS business application, maybe a horizontal application, so it's not specific to one vertical, where would you set up? Just off the top of your head.
So if my market was LATAM, for example, I would probably look to have an entity in Mexico. If my market was APAC, ideally it'd be China, but due to complexities, I would say Singapore. It tends to be a bit more easier to navigate as a landscape. If it's Europe, I think there's not for no reason. I'm going to be biased. I live in the Netherlands. No, just kidding. I would probably say Ireland. Germany is also relatively, it's super stable and easier to navigate there as well. I think one of the interesting locations in Europe that is popping up right now is Portugal. So I think it'd be interesting to see how the government continues to evolve there as well to make it more accessible for SaaS businesses to set up.
Huh, super interesting. And interesting that you say Ireland. And
Tax benefits.
yeah, the tax benefits, and even though it's not part of Brexit, it's close enough, the connections between Ireland and the UK, and then it's obviously part of the EU.
Exactly. It's like in the center there working.
There was a period where the Netherlands and Amsterdam were really sort of touted as the hot place for tech companies, particularly just because of the language, and everybody seems like everybody speaks English, but also a multitude of languages, so you get the benefit of that. Whereas, sad to say, but Irish and British tend to be more like the Americans, and not always as fluent in other languages.
Yeah, the Netherlands definitely has a lot of tech activity, a lot of startups, and it's being really encouraged as well by the tax environment around companies.
And there's also a fair amount of investment,
yes,
or investment capital that is accessible in the Netherlands.
Yes,
or
absolutely.
in Scandinavia, definitely.
And to your point as well, why go global? It opens up many more investment opportunities. There's a lot of investors that are not US based, that just by getting exposure to your brand will also help with that angle of the SaaS.
Yeah, and we definitely see that, and I've been exposed more through Bain in addition to a lot of investors in specifically in Europe. So with that, I want to encourage everybody to provide questions, but just to summarize, Danielle, what do you think are the most important things about deciding to do it right when you, as a company that has never operated internationally? What would you recommend?
Listen to the business opportunities for your customers so you can make a wise selection on which market you're going to take first. Just because a market is, for example, the largest, it might or may not have a fit for your software and your business. So make sure you're listening to your customers before selecting one, a country where you want to expand. I think especially when you're a small business, you want to make sure there's an ROI there. I think that's the biggest thing, because it will require a lot of time. It does require a lot of effort. It does require financial investment to open these entities and do business locally. So make sure as well that your payment provider is giving you the best options at how they're routing their payments, and make sure you know the financial landscape of what you're walking into. So definitely, I would say focus where your biggest opportunity is at, and often your customers are a good indication of that. And yeah, we said, leverage existing operational platforms. Definitely use Paddle to get you there. No, but I think it's so important to have companies like Paddle and just having this global connectivity that you don't have to go at it alone. There are so many different solutions. Like Paddle is an absolute end-to-end solutions and a fix-all to the global. You'll immediately have access to the global market, but there's nobody that can do this alone. I think for companies previously where we did not have Paddle, we actually had to make sure that we, again, similar to the payroll solution, have a local partner that can actually scale with you globally in the accounting compliance, in tax compliance, help you, give you advice around your treasury setup. Because just because you have an entity, setting up a bank account in like 150 countries may not make sense. So it's definitely important to have a good treasury business partner as well that can advise you in how to go about that.
Yeah, no, I think, and I guess in terms of my own advice and my experience with doing it myself, as well as talking to lots of primarily American companies, I think it's so much about having experienced people. It's so much easier today than it used to be, because there are great platforms like Paddle or Avalara for taxes, and just other platforms that are terrific. Because it used to be in the old days, at best, you would just work with one of the big 5 sort of accounting firms or the big legal firms to support you, but you had to have all the infrastructure, all the admin, all the finance people to manage everything manually. And you don't have to do that anymore. But I do think on the sales and on the product side, it's about having experienced people. And I think it's not rocket science. It's not as hard as some people think it is, and it doesn't have to be as hugely expensive as people think. I think it's more an issue that you have to view it like a startup, and you invest in startups, and you invest in sort of a multifaceted organization for a startup. And the problem is that a lot of companies don't go internationally until they're really mature. So they think it's just like, rolling it out in the same way they would in their established markets. And it's not. You need to go back to the way you did things when you were first starting out. And so it's important to have experienced business people, and it's important to have experienced, product people, because you are going to have to listen to differences. And in the world that we're in today, customers, whether they're in, the US or in Europe or in China, expect, they have a very low tolerance of, something that's foreign or doesn't work for them properly. And, the same way that B2B has had to learn that B2B customers are now sort of like B2C customers, because we all have just gotten so used to the ease of use of our applications on the consumer side that we expect that on the business side. It's the same thing internationally, I think.
I agree to your point. You cannot copy and paste your business. I do think that needs to be some modification. And I think especially if we look at some large companies, either that are outside of the US or inside the US, just cannot, for example, figure branding out. And these are just challenges to make sure that you're understanding how people are thinking and don't assume that everybody's the same.
Exactly. Well, with that, I know we've taken most of the questions. If anyone feels that there's any other questions that they'd like to particularly ask Danielle, because I know she is super busy and will be totally tied up, because Paddle is just, it's unbelievable when you think about 2,000 SaaS companies on your platform. That's incredible.
And growing.
So I can't wait to see our latest benchmarks, because I believe that they will be quite different, and showing the impact of the acceleration of the digital world, after COVID. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see that. So with that, thank you, Danielle. This has been terrific. I really appreciate your insights and your experience, and thank you to the team behind us, Whitney and Chloe, who have made this possible. Whitney, we have another SaaS conversation coming up the end of this month. Is it the 23rd, I think, of March?
Yes, it's the 23rd, and we'll be featuring Andrew Lau from Jellyfish. I just reposted the link in the chat again for everyone who's still on the line. If you have not done so, please register today to save your seat.
Excellent. Excited about that, but excited to maybe revisit this topic a year from now and see how much has changed. The world is very global. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.